Good morning and thank you. I'll preface this by saying that I usually speak extemporaneously and I'm not used to reading a talk. And I don't know how well I read. I just like to sit and chat, but that's not the way this is working out apparently. I do think that it's appropriate that I'm given the honor of introducing my book here in this building, the Alabama Department of Archives and History. I spent a great deal of my life here, most of that very happy times in my life. And I want to pay special tribute to the Alabama Department of Archives and History and express my great thanks to Joe McInnes and the Blunt Foundation for making the publication of this book possible. When I was still too young to drive, and on Saturdays or in summer when school was out, I took every opportunity to ride along with my parents when they were coming to Montgomery and to be dropped off here. My recollection is that I was the only teenager to be found crawling in the stacks of this library, where I was completely happy, buried in musty old books and papers. Once I had the temerity to ask to see the archives director, the Venerable Mary Bankhead Owen, in hopes of having some baffling historical matter satisfactorily explained. I entered her lofty precincts to be faced with what seemed to me to be a monumental figure of Buddha, sitting motionless and glaring at me. Mrs. Mary Bankhead Owen was not amused. There are conflicting legends about the methods she employed to cajole the money out of President Roosevelt to build this great monument to Alabama history that we're in this morning, when the Depression was at its darkest. But I am here to tell you that charm could not have been one of them. She told me quickly enough that she had no idea what the answer to my question was, and that she hadn't the time to worry about it, and I beat a hasty retreat. Even as I tell that insignificant anecdote so many years later, I can still see her as clearly in my mind's eye as if she was still there across the hall, scaring mortal hell out of whoever approached her. I begin this brief talk with reading you a part of my introduction to Carolina planters on the Alabama frontier. This book had its unlikely beginning when I began taking piano lessons at the age of 5. I lived with my family in what was then the country outside Tallahassee, Alabama, and it was emphasized that I was the 6th generation to live in the vicinity, there since the Indians. I was sent on foot twice a week across Stone Creek and then up the hill to a house with a wide veranda around all 4 sides called Hillcrest. It was the home of our reclusive old cousin, William Robson-McKenzie, and his second wife, Eva Smith McKenzie. My recollection is that, though the piano lessons from Cousin Eva were for 45 minutes, and I despised those lessons, I always stayed all day. Those protracted visits gave me a glimpse of the remote Indians who had lived where our houses were and whose arrowheads my brothers and I sometimes found in the yard. Cousin Will owned the slat-back wagon chair in which his grandfather, Colonel John Howland McKenzie, had sat to drive his team to Alabama in the long journey from South Carolina to Alabama in 1836. Thus I became aware not only of the Indians, but of those intrepid early settlers who were somehow connected directly to me. The tales that Cousin Will and Eva told in that twilit, tapestry-hung house set me on a lifelong effort to understand the South, past and present. Cousin Eva wasn't like anyone else I was ever to know. She had studied music at a conservatory in Richmond as a girl and ever afterwards retained a Tidewater, Virginia speech, speaking of going for a drive in her car or working in her garden. She always dressed as for a garden party in flowing chiffons and crepe de chines that smelled musty, as indeed did the whole house, and she wore a pince-nez attached to a long gold chain and a great rope of false pearls. Her stomach rumbled beside me on the piano bench, explained by my father as being because old Eva's too tight to buy groceries. Wouldn't spend a nickel to see an ant eat a bale of hay. Cousin Will was a shuffling old man in a silk smoking jacket with drooping white mustaches, a kind smile, a gruff voice, and red-rimmed eyes with deep bags under them. I was then far from understanding the effects of long-term alcohol consumption. Cousin Will was finally to die of drink at the age of 85. To the amazement of my parents, I found the old cousins exciting company, and I swallowed their stories whole. What I was told during this period that lasted some 5 years were some wonderfully grandiose tales of the Old South, of wealth and luxury unbounded. All had been taken away by Yankees, a breed of fiends made up of immigrants from unspeakable places, more dangerous than Germans or communists, though there were said to be plenty of those too where the Yankees dwelled. I was told that the Indians had been evil in resisting white men encroaching on their lands, when those interlopers were merely offering them civilized lives in the communion of saints. The poverty and ignorance which had befallen the Negro was caused entirely by the vicious Yankees freeing him from slavery, in which condition he had not only been tenderly cared for, but as happy as a lark. Good family, lest we forget, was everything. Cousin Eva informed me at Christmas time, following her reading to me the story of the Nativity, that the Virgin Mary had been from a perfectly lovely family and beautifully educated. That was from the introduction. Reading this account, one could suggest that it was the recipe for a warped childhood. In fact, it was a happy and secure childhood. Children, I think, tend to react well to adults who treat them kindly and take them as they are, not pondering as to whether they are eccentric or perhaps strange. I liked cousins Will and Eva just as they were, and enjoying their company had no baleful influence on me that I'm aware of. What I retained from that period, by filtering through all Cousin Eva's Gone with the Wind fantasies, was a genuine love of history. When I was in college, a second Civil War began over the unresolved issues of the first one a century later. I saw that conflict quite closely, and what I saw was enough to begin to take any twisted mindset with which I had been afflicted and to gradually set it straight. Thus I could see the Old South and this unsettling New South with some clarity, all in one piece. Quite ironically, and simultaneous with this civil rights upheaval, there appeared the first group of family letters written by slave-holding planters and their families from early Alabama, and they illuminated a troubled world that novels and films had ignored. Those letters led to the discovery of more letters, all carefully saved in a widespread family connection that, as they said with devastating accuracy, kept everything but the land and the money. It took a long time to put them together and to research the events they spoke of in order to put it into context. Eventually, the collected papers made a fairly cohesive whole, a narrative of indulged but courageous early Americans who laid the foundations for the state of Alabama. This is the first of the pictures, which is the jacket of the book. There is Harriet Carolyn Spencer and her husband, Dr. William Fleming, two affluent but disgruntled souls who moved from Chesterfield District, South Carolina, to Prairie Bluff on the Alabama River in Wilcox County in 1831. They had great plantations and many slaves, and her letters to her mother are unhappy ones, with good reason. She complained of Dr. Fleming, saying that he cared only for money, though it turned out that money was not his only interest outside the family circle. And she wrote that none of the Spencer sons-in-law had deserved what they had, which was virtuous wives. She bore Fleming 16 children, only 6 of whom lived beyond childhood. We are very much discouraged losing our children, she wrote to her mother. Being discouraged is an ineffective term to describe the tragedies that pioneer Americans of her generation lived with daily. While she suffered, Dr. Fleming was riding back to Georgetown, South Carolina, to try to purchase his slave mistress, Louisa, and her 3 children, quite clearly his children too, guaranteeing that they would never be slaves again. The owner would not sell them, and they were not freed, and now they are lost to history. Here are the Flemings, then, staring at us solemnly from our antebellum past, the portrait of the planter ideal, surrounded by vast estates and servants and with untaxed cotton wealth. Between them is the ghostly image of her niece, Elizabeth Rebecca Spencer, and two of the Carolina houses from the 18th century where the family had begun. It had actually begun before that in faraway Connecticut, where a fourth-generation English-American named Elihu Spencer, gifted and with high ambitions, graduated from Yale in 1846. He became a Presbyterian preacher, and in due time he was posted to New Jersey and was soon a trustee of the College of New Jersey at Princeton, where although he swore lifelong allegiance to Yale, he was connected all the rest of his life with Princeton. He was a prominent patriot during the Revolution, and the British set out to silence him and his influence. They put a bounty on his head and destroyed his great library, not the library of a Puritan, but that of a brilliant, cultivated scholar, which broke his heart. When victory was finally won, John Adams traveled to Trenton to celebrate victory by being inspired by Elihu's sermon. Elihu's brother Samuel Spencer died during the French and Indian War and left a widow and several children. Elihu took three of the fatherless nephews back to New Jersey with him to be educated. He must have picked the boys he judged the most attractive and with the most potential. He put the eldest nephew, Samuel Spencer, at Princeton, where he graduated in 1759 in law and was soon sent south to Anson County, North Carolina, which Elihu had seen and judged to have unlimited opportunities. Anson County was at the western end of the colony, and in fact it had no western boundary. It stretched out through what was to become Tennessee, clear to the Mississippi River. It was peopled by rough, unlettered frontiersmen, and Elihu knew that his nephew Samuel could be the leader of the area, as he was as polished and educated a gentleman as it was to see, and a clever lawyer and politician to boot. He made his name and his fortune quickly, and like all successful people, he was controversial. Elihu carefully educated the next nephew, Oliver, and married him off to a New Jersey heiress. The youngest of the boys, Calvin, was 20 years younger than his older brother Samuel, but despite that age difference, they were the closest and most devoted of brothers. Samuel extricated young Calvin from his uncle and set him up at the age of 20 as a landowner and a county officer in Chesterfield District, South Carolina, just over the line from Samuel's home in Anson. These brothers embraced the local system and became powerful landowners. Their Calvinistic heritage was lost in the transition. Adherents of the Church of England and developed a cavalier appreciation of high living. They also became slave owners. They became, in short, Southerners. The letters and documents are all here to tell how these three brothers, disciples of their uncle Elihu, were delegates to their state conventions to ratify the new Constitution. Oliver was in New Jersey. Now, I didn't do that, right? There he is. It's all in knowing which button to push. And there he is in uniform, and he had an exploit where he captured a British supply ship, and the artist has very cleverly put the British ship in the background of this portrait. And that is Oliver Spencer, who lived in New Jersey, where his brothers were in the South. At the time of the Constitution, Oliver was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in New Jersey, Samuel to the one in North Carolina, Calvin to the one in South Carolina. Samuel had a bit of fight to keep North Carolina from ratifying the Constitution because it had no Bill of Rights. Our rights are not safeguarded, he said. There's no Declaration of Rights, those unalienable rights which ought not to be given up to any government, he argued. He joined George Mason of Virginia, and the Constitution got its Bill of Rights. And it has only been in recent years that North Carolina historians have given Samuel Spencer due credit for his part in it. In South Carolina, Calvin Spencer entered the service as a major, was cited as a brave officer, and fell in love with Rebecca Ford, who lived on a plantation on Black River near Georgetown in the Low Country. Well, that's not right. I'm sorry. Let's see. There it is. It's a house called The Grove on Black River outside of Georgetown. And I'm going to tell you that the South Carolinians don't say the Black River. They just say Black River. And it's on Black River. And it's now called Beneventum. But Calvin Spencer went there in full uniform in 1781 to court Rebecca Ford, who lived with her brother and her sister and brother-in-law in this house. He tethered his horse across Black River to a tree and took a small rowboat across, and he was no sooner carefully inside the house and meeting with Rebecca than the house was swarmed by British dragoons who took him captive. He attempted to escape by swimming Black River, but he couldn't make it. He wanted to get to his horse, and he was captured. His wife Rebecca later wrote that he was thrown into a dungeon. Later, he was exchanged and finished the war with a generous letter from George Washington praising his service. In 1782, he returned to the house, to this very house, and married Rebecca Ford, who brought with her a dowry equivalent to modern-day $600,000. He took her and her very helpful fortune to his property in Chesterfield, where he acquired 30,000 acres of land and 12 children. And I'm happy to say that this is one of the few of the houses connected with the family that is still standing, and as you can see, is in good order. This is a recent photograph. Samuel Spencer died in 1793, having been acting governor of the new state and North Carolina's first Chief Justice and a founder of the University of North Carolina. You'll have to read the book to find out how he died. It's too remarkable a story to miss. I can only hint that it involved a rooster. Calvin Spencer had a memorial to his brother painted in miniature on ivory. That's it. Here it is, painted in hair pigment. That was made actually from Samuel Spencer's own hair, made into a paint. And you can be absolutely certain that Samuel Spencer didn't look like that. Nor was it intended to be a true likeness of him. It is rather an idealized portrait of mourning, with weeping willows and a broken column and a thoughtful young man who looks like a Regency dandy. Rebecca Ford Spencer gave it to her granddaughter, Elizabeth Mackenzie, who brought it to Alabama in a covered wagon in 1836. Each Spencer daughter had inherited 1,700 acres from Calvin Spencer's estate, but the land was not rich enough to satisfy Spencer ambitions. Word traveled of the cheap and fertile river lands to be had in the great Southwest, then the western frontier of the United States, composed of the Mississippi Territory, which included what was to become the states of Mississippi and Alabama and parts of Louisiana. In 1811, the eldest Spencer child, Eliza, and her husband, Alexander Poe, decided to move to Wayne County, Mississippi. They received a passport from the governor of Georgia to leave the United States of America and to travel through the Creek Nation of Indian, they taking care to conduct themselves peaceably towards the Indians and agreeably to the laws of the United States. The Poes moved in wagons, their possessions in hogsheads, rolled across a part of the federal road till it ran out, and the rest raw wilderness all the way over to Mississippi, along with 70 slaves. Traveling with them was Eliza Spencer Poe's brother-in-law, Peter Lord Robeson, who had married her sister, Mary Spencer. The Poes were moving to stay, but Peter Lord Robeson was along for the ride, in hopes of finding a new home and great wealth for his own family. He didn't stay, but returned to Chesterfield. Now, that's Peter Lord Robeson. It's a portrait at the top, rather dark. And this is a silhouette of Peter Lord Robeson and his wife, Mary Spencer, probably cut about in Charleston about the time they married in 1806. The family told that Rebecca Ford Spencer sent her children to the west with buckets of gold. Alabama, let it be noted, was the west. And the buckets of gold is very likely true. They were not poor men and women seeking a new fortune, for poor men could not afford the rich river-bottom lands of the slaves to cultivate it. These were rich and ambitious pioneers when they arrived, determined only to get richer. They acquired the finest plantations to be had. A few years later, another Spencer daughter, Anne Shaw Spencer-McKerrell, and her husband William, and William's child from his first marriage, William McKerrell Jr., and there he is. He is in mourning for his dead mother, who apparently had died when he was in childbirth, and he's wearing black ribbons and a hat and carrying his rattle. And he came with his stepmother, Ann Spencer, and his father to Wilcox County, Alabama, before Alabama became a state. Soon afterwards came her brother, William Ford Spencer, who also settled at Black's Bluff, where the McKerrells were on the Alabama River. And in 1831, her brother Henry Spencer and his wife Eliza, and her sister Harriet Spencer Fleming and Dr. Fleming. At the same time, 4 of the Poe nephews from Wayne County, Mississippi, moved over to Wilcox County and bought plantations. And 2 of their sisters married affluent city men from Philadelphia and moved to Mobile. Wilcox County now had 8 Spencer family plantations. They also had urban relations in town in Mobile, which was very pleasant for them. And this, one of the sisters, Mary Ann Poe, married a man named Edward Hall, and he built this house in Gulf Coast architecture in downtown Mobile. And this is a Habs photograph from the 1930s. And I'm happy to say that this house has just recently been completely restored and is open to the public in downtown Mobile. And Edward Hall was also a founder of Christ Church Mobile, which was just adjacent to this house. They wrote constant letters home to their powerful matriarch, Rebecca, who controlled her widespread family with demands of their loyalty and attention and with her pocketbook. Elihu Spencer was the most prolific letter writer, and as Ed Bridges noted when he read this book, she was always so miserable. She wrote of her beautiful children, their talent and their sayings, and then the next letter would tell that the gifted child had died. Fevers were constant, and medical science was little improved since the Middle Ages. All the letters have accounts of illness and of the fear of illness. Fleeing to high ground during the rainy season and denouncing towns, Tuscaloosa and Montgomery among them, is unhealthy. We are like the ancient Romans, Rebecca Ford Fleming wrote to her grandmother, taking refuge in our temples in times of danger. William Ford Spencer had 8 children, and 4 of them died, the usual grim statistic. His wonderful 1837 house, Spencer Place, is abandoned now, and it's in a hunting reserve. This is a drawing of how it looked. It looks very much like certain houses that were built in the lower Mississippi River Valley with an outside stairway. It was called Spencer Place. It was built in the 1830s, and even though abandoned and endangered, it is there. Finally, in 1836, Eliza and Henry Spencer lost all of their remaining children in one deadly week of fever, and they fled. Their niece, Elizabeth Ann Robson, and her husband, John Highland Mackenzie, had recently settled near the first town of Tallahassee on the Tallapoosa River, near what had been the capital of the Creek Nation. Henry and Eliza went there. Eliza refused to live at Black's Bluff again, and she went there only long enough to sell their plantation and, as one letter says, to box up their dead children and move them to a new plantation adjoining the Mackenzies. These were women of wealth and privilege, but they worked without ceasing while constantly bearing children, and every childbirth was a potential death sentence. They oversaw the vast vegetable gardens and flocks of chickens and turkeys and pigs and cattle that were required to feed 100 people a day. One family, as Eliza called it, both black and white. "My house is so small and cold," she wrote once, "but I am very busy making Negro clothes." She spoke often of a child servant named Henny, whom she was rearing in the house with her children and whom she describes as light in color. Another servant is shown as Yellow Catherine. She called her Katie and declares that she never wished to own her. She doesn't give her reasons, but it is safe to assume that Katie was a close relation whose condition of servitude aroused guilt in her owner. Henry and Eliza never had luck in Alabama with finding a good overseer. Their crops were never good enough. They could not travel to see their South Carolina family for pecuniary reasons, as she wrote. Nothing turned out well for Henry and Eliza Spencer. Next door, the Mackenzies prospered. And here they are. These are portraits painted of John Highland Mackenzie and his wife Elizabeth Ann Robeson about 1833, before they came to Alabama. And she is wearing, it's very dim, but she is wearing as a breastpin there the memorial miniature to Samuel Spencer. Eliza and Henry died together in one fatal week in 1844, the final act of this most sad of family dramas. The Mackenzies took their last surviving child, Lizzie, and raised her as their own. This is Elizabeth Rebecca Spencer, called Lizzie, when she was at school at Wesleyan in Macon, Georgia, wearing all her jewelry. Lizzie Spencer and her Mackenzie and Spencer and Poe cousins all were sent away to school, never to forget that they were ladies and gentlemen of gentle breeding. The boys went to the University of South Carolina, or to Oglethorpe University in Georgia, or LaGrange College in North Alabama. The girls to Judson in Marion, or to the female college in Tuscaloosa, or to Wesleyan in Macon, or Hamden Hall in Montgomery. Mary Mackenzie wrote from Judson that she had never seen as many ugly girls in one place in her life. When a particularly boring professor lectured interminably, she wrote that the room had gotten awfully windy. By the 1850s, the worst pioneer times were past. There they were at last, living luxurious lives, much like their grandparents had lived in the Carolinas in the 18th century, with all the accompanying Southern pride, which was first instilled in them by Elihu Spencer a century before. Never mind that he lived in New Jersey, it was Southern pride. Now they were creating the Southern myth. The matter of the relationship of slaveholders and their female slaves has been an exceedingly touchy subject in the South, even more so in the 20th century, when the general practice was to look on the antebellum period as idyllic and without flaw. Modern historians have studied the issue seriously, using as a starting point the sharp comment of the diarist Mary Boykin Chestnut. The mulattoes one sees in every family exactly resemble the white children, and every lady tells you who's the father of all the mulatto children in everybody's household, but those in her own, she seems to think, dropped from the clouds, or pretend so to think. They couldn't address the matter, not then, not later. In the introduction to this book, the slaves are described as the heart of the plantation world, a structure that would collapse without them. Despite arguments to this day that the Civil War was about states' rights and not slavery, a close look at their essential records tells another story. In 1840, John Mackenzie inventoried his assets at his Tallapoosa plantation. He owned 109 slaves valued at $54,850. Now, mind you, they were worth a great deal more 20 years later in 1860. An average in 1840 of about 500. His land, about 3,000 acres, was valued at $12,000. The slaves were worth more than 4.5 times the value of the land. Land was valueless without the slaves to work it. The planter's wealth was in human flesh. Without that resource, they would be bankrupt. It is not simplistic to say that's why Southerners fought the Civil War. It's basic freshman economics. Slave owners they were, but they were also brave and adventurous people who were not afraid to climb into wagons in the cold dawn and travel over impossibly rough terrain to find new homes and expand this nation. Theirs is the peculiarly American story. Despite spending their lives with blinders on, they meant well, and they were the products of generations of slaveholders who had come to believe that this was the natural order. They and their descendants couldn't acknowledge that it was slavery that had brought about the war, and slavery that had destroyed them in the end, most of all that the collapse of the system was their own fault. Here's a picture of William Ford Spencer and his wife Lucinda in 1865. Those are the faces of defeat. Their woebegone looks tell it all, actually. But William Ford Spencer never forgot that he was a gentleman planter and the son of Colonel Calvin Spencer of South Carolina. At least I've never had to saddle my own horse, he said at the last. Whatever had been lost, family pride prevailed. I wrote the index for this book, and in the process came to realize that I had to write a separate index to include every slave mentioned and where he or she lived, so that each of them is given the distinction of having existed and having a name and having suffered. This is their story too. Let us hope that one of their families who is seeking his or her lost heritage can find a clue to it in these pages. Thank you.
Question and answer. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. Christina or I will give you the microphone, speak into the microphone so that all of the people in the overflow auditorium will be able to hear the questions. So raise your hand if you have a question for us.
Through my studies of Alabama history, I noticed that a lot of South Carolinians, when they settled in Alabama, they kept a close political connection with South Carolina and influenced the secession of South Carolina as well as Alabama. Did your family was involved in that?
I really don't know, because politics is so rarely mentioned in these letters. The letters tend to be mainly about what's happening on the plantation and about family, because they're writing to grandmother. So there's very little discussion. But there is one issue of nullification involving the Mackenzies at one point. But as you well know, when Alabama was formed, there were the main factions of the Georgians and the Carolinians who struggled to control this new state. So yes, there was a strong political aspect to the Carolinians in Alabama, but I didn't find it much in these letters. Thank you.
Having come from Carville, I wondered how long the old grist mill there had been in your family.
Well, my grandfather bought the first grist mill in 1915 in Macon County, Pattillo, and then my father opened the mill in East Tallahassee in 1933, when he and my mother were married in January 1933. Thank you.
I was just going to say, I'm a Wesson. My grandfather run H.C. Wesson store right up the road.
Yes, that's right. Good. Thank you for coming.
Next question.
Eddie, where did the Patillos come into the lineage?
Because my mother married a Pattillo. My mother was a Guthrie. Her mother was a Mackenzie, and she married my father in 1933. It's a Scottish name for those who think it might be Italian, but it's very Scottish. I've had to explain it all my life.
Of all the people that you've studied over the years, which ones have been the most influential in terms of ancestors that have most influenced your life, do you feel?
Influenced my life?
Yes. Or that you most felt great.
Well, I say in the introduction, there were two generals in the family whom I don't mention in this talk at all. One of them was General William Lord Robson, who fought in the War of 1812, and his letters, I think, are the most brilliant letters to be found in this book. They're absolutely fascinating. And he wrote one wonderful letter about when the word came that the Treaty of Ghent had been signed, which ended the War of 1812. This was in 1815. And it took 15 days for the word to get from Washington City to New Orleans, where he was posted. And he was given the job of going over to the British commander and telling the British commander that the war was over and they had been defeated and could go home. And And he said, I saw the flower of Wellington's army there. And so wonderful letters from him. The other one later on in the Civil War was General James Holt Clendon, who was a cousin. And he was a remarkable character. And Clendon, Alabama is named for him. And there's a street named Clendon here. And after the war, he was head of the Democratic Party in the state of Alabama, and he was much hated by the occupation government and much feared. And he went to Knoxville as state's attorney on a railroad case in 1871, and he was shot down on the street by a former federal officer. And they brought him back to Montgomery by train and had the first state funeral in Alabama's history. His body lay in state in the rotunda of the Capitol, and when they took him to Oakwood Cemetery, 10,000 people followed on foot. He is now forgotten, but he was a very prominent citizen, and I've always been fascinated by him, I must say. The two military figures, for some reason, have always influenced me a great deal. Thank you. Yes.
Mr. Pattillo.
Yes.
I would just like to thank you for writing this book, and as a personal friend of mine, I've enjoyed what little bit I've had a chance to read of it, and it goes back through a lot of interesting stuff. Those of you who haven't read or have thought about buying the book, it would be well worth it because it's a very interesting book. And I just want to tell you thank you from my heart for writing this book, because I love history, and there's a lot of documentation in this book about history that brings a lot of interesting points that a lot of people don't understand or realize actually happened then.
Thank you very much.
Do we have one more question? If not, Mr. Pattillo will be here a few minutes after the program. He'll be glad to sign.
There's a question.
Sign your books, and after this question, we will conclude the program.
What is your next book?
It's based on your life. And I expect it to be a bestseller.
Thank you very much for coming, and Mr. Pattillo will be available after the program.
Thank you very much.